You heard it here first on the 415ers podcast, 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Odyssey Sports Podcast Network. Evan Giddings and Marc Grandy with you as always. Getting away from the Rams and back to the 49ers, I did think you brought up something kind of interesting, especially it just popped into my mind when you mentioned the secondary, the amount of depth that this defense has back there, because something that we sort of touched on but didn't really get into in the last episode was the comparison between this defense and the 2019 defense. Of course, one that helped the Niners go 13-3, go to the Super Bowl, come up just a bit short against the Kansas City Chiefs, but had them right there. The difference to me in that team, I mean, I know they had some bigger talent. They were a little bit younger on the outside. I mean, a couple of these guys were on that group. If you're looking at, um, the likes of Emmanuel Mosley on the outside, but Richard Sherman sort of led the way for that corner group. K'Wan Williams, Tarvarius Moore, like those were guys that were kind of in and out, but were very young. I mean, Mosley was 23 years old. Moore was 23 years old. Kella Witherspoon, 24 years old on that team. Like they have a lot more, I think, leadership and veteran presence on the outside because we don't need to spend much time talking about how great the defensive line has been. Even though Eric Armstead might be dealing with a foot injury, to me, they're the deepest defensive line in the league. Their linebackers, even with the absence of Azeez Al-Shaair, has looked like they haven't missed a beat with Fred Warner along with Dre Greenlaw, who's really come into his own and has looked, especially on Monday night, like Navarro Bowman-esque. But to me, that may be the one area where I could say, okay, this team could rival that defense because of its corner play and because it might be a little bit deeper on the outside. Top heavy, I'm not sure if there's any one-on-one corner that's going to be, as good as Richard Sherman was for that group. But to me, if you're looking at a comparison and trying to figure out which defense is better, granted, it's been 4 games, there's a long way to go, but on paper, they're on pace to be better than that defense. And I think if you want to make a case, the one area where you're saying, all right, this is where they have the edge, to me would be on the outside.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that, is what I was mentioning earlier. This is a situation that the Niners have never really had under Kyle Shanahan. I think you could even say, even back to Jim Harbaugh. I mean, it's always been the front seven that's been the strength of the 49ers defenses for a long time now. It's never really been the secondary. They've had good players there. You mentioned Richard Sherman, but he wasn't in his prime at that point. He still was a really good player and one of the best players in the Niners secondary in 2019, that run to the Super Bowl. But they haven't really had this depth. And I agree that I think is what separates that 2019 defense and this 2022 defense. Now, it's still early, of course, you're 4 games in, but you look at some of the numbers and some of the returns here. The 49ers are allowing 3.8 yards per play. And again, just 4 games in, you play one bad game where you give up 30 points, and that number is going to jump a lot because it's a relatively small sample size. But 3.8. When you consider some of the better offenses from recent memory, I mean, the 2015 Broncos, 4.4 yards per play. 2013 Seahawks, 4.4 yards per play. Those 2019 49ers, 4.7 yards per play. I mean, so you're a half a yard to about a whole yard worse than the current Niners at 3.8 yards per play. And I would argue, even though it is early, that the way that the NFL game is being played now, even different than it was in 2013 and 2015, there has been an offensive explosion. So that 3.8 number is even more impressive than it would have been back in 2013, 2014, 2015. Again, it's early. We're probably getting a bit ahead of ourselves, but that 3.8 number is historically relevant and impressive. And if the Niners are even anywhere near that ballpark towards the end of the year, this will go down as not only the best defense in the NFL this year, but one of the best in recent memory in the NFL.
Well, and just to back you up, I believe I saw a stat that no team has had a 3.8 yard per play throughout an entire season, grant you, average since the 1977 season. So, we're not just talking about the Legion of Boom. We're talking about the 2000 Ravens. We're talking about, great defenses from the 90s, from the 80s, from the late 70s. I mean, even some of the great defenses that the Niners had, taking a look at the 94 team or before that, like there's a lot of excellent defenses in times where maybe passing and points were less high than they are now, but still, I mean, they're on pace to go down as one of the best. And that's the crazy part to me too. Is I mean, I sort of mentioned it last episode, but like if they did do it, I wouldn't necessarily be shocked just because of how good they've looked so far. Like the whole premise that defense travels sometimes can get a bit misconstrued, but when you have a team that's this deep and that has already kind of gotten through a couple of injuries, some of them more impactful than others, but have larger part maintained the same core. Um, this is a team that, look, yeah, may give up some points down the road to a Chiefs team, maybe a Cardinals team. Looking at a Chargers team that's pretty good on offense, but also then again, you got the next couple of weeks against the Panthers and the Falcons, who offensively are not very good teams. And in fact, this weekend against the Panthers, Baker Mayfield has been one of the worst quarterbacks in football. So as much as you might give up a 4.5 yard per play game against one of those better offenses, you might also hold the Panthers to less than 3.5, less than 3.8. And they might still be right back on track where they are this week after next week.
Oh my God. We'll talk about, that Panthers game more on the Friday edition of the podcast, but that might be just a bloodbath for the Panthers offensively. I mean, Christian McCaffrey is special. He'll probably pull a couple of crazy plays off and get the team, in scoring range, and maybe he'll break a touchdown himself. But Baker Mayfield has just looked so bad. That might be a tough game to watch on Sunday. I mean, the Niners defense is so good, and Baker Mayfield has looked so bad. I mean, DJ Moore is one of the more talented receivers in the NFL, and he's essentially a non-factor against, middle of the pack defenses in this league. So I am I'm looking forward to it, obviously, because I want to see the 49ers play well and see that defense show off. But it might be a relatively ugly display of offense in that game, and it might be kind of difficult to watch, kind of like a train wreck. Like you just can't take your eyes away because it's so bad.
Do you think that the defense for the 49ers had its best performance of the season against the Rams? Like that was at its best?
I think the Niners players would tell you that. I know what Fred Warner said after the Broncos game, which they gave up 9 points against a future Hall of Fame
Yeah,
quarterback.
they're pretty good in Denver.
Yeah, but Fred Warner said, we didn't force any turnovers. So, 9 points. And what does it really mean when you don't force a turnover and give your offense chances to score? And they forced multiple turnovers against the Rams. So he would probably tell you the Rams' performance was better. But I don't know. I mean, I guess it comes down to whose offense do you respect more, the Rams or the Broncos? And I guess I would say the Rams at this point. So I would think I would agree with Fred Warner and say that the Rams was the better defensive performance.
Yeah, I'm with you. It just feels like you could kind of make a case almost for the last 3 games. I mean, I know the Seahawks are not very good, but defense didn't give up a single point. I
That's
mean, it was
true.
a special teams touchdown that put Seattle on the board. So, I mean, it's that's the thing. We're basically splitting hairs here about 3 games in which the defense is absolutely dominated.
Yeah, when you can easily make a case for the last 3 games, your team is probably playing pretty well.
um, and a big part of that, and I want to use this to kind of going off on a tangent for a sec about Talanoa Hufanga. And we spent a lot of time in the last episode, just going through how remarkable his pick six was, how instinctual it was, how much of a gamble it was, according to Kyle Shanahan, in a play where, quote, you better be right when you make that play because, look, if you're up 8 and that's a wheel route, Cooper Kupp's taking that to the crib and we might have ourselves a tie game. So Talanoa Hufanga makes a risky play, makes an educated guess, and he guessed right, and he sealed the game for the 49ers. And that's why, although people have understandably compared him to the great Troy Polamalu, like they're both Polynesian, they both play a similar position, they both went to USC. To me, it's low-hanging fruit. And I don't think they are necessarily comparable because, at least when I think of Polamalu, I think of a big hitter, I think of an acrobatic player. And although Hufanga has some of those athletic traits, to me, he's much more like an Ed Reed than a Troy Polamalu because Ed Reed was a guy that was allowed to play with his head as much as his physical gifts. And he was a guy that, look, on the great Ravens defenses of the early 2000s, Like, they kind of just let him play center field. And sometimes, no matter what the defense was, he just did what he wanted to. And that's kind of how Talanoa Hufanga plays to me, or at least has so far with this 49ers defense as he's grown into himself in his second season. He plays with almost a feel for the game that you can't really game plan for because you don't exactly know what he's going to do. He saw that pick or that pick six that sealed the game. As he mentioned, it was something on tape earlier that week. He recognized a play earlier in the game. There was a similar setup late, and he jumped the route knowing exactly where the ball was going to be, not even considering the fact that he might get beat deep. That, to me, is more of an Ed Reed play than a Polamalu play, and why I would compare his instincts right now to the Hall of Famer of the Ravens rather than the Steelers.
That's interesting. It is always funny when, I think Troy Aikman said on the Monday Night Football broadcast, Talanoa Hufanga, he really reminds you of Troy Polamalu. Like, yeah, you don't say. I mean, that's what everyone has been saying about Talanoa Hufanga. And I think it's a very easy comparison to make. And as you mentioned, low hanging fruit. There are certainly some similarities that are hard to ignore.
I forgot about the big hair. That was my bad.
The big hair as well. And, there a safety likes to play up in the box, and you see him blitz off the edge, try to time the snap count. We don't see that quite as much from Hufanga, but you do see it every so often. I mean, he had that great tackle in the backfield. I believe it was the Broncos game where he just timed the snap and was unblocked in the backfield and could have either sacked the quarterback or tackled the running back, whichever got the ball. But I do like that comparison specifically, about Ed Reed and how he used his mind and kind of his ability to see the game to his benefit. And it was what Nick Bosa said about Talanoa Hufanga after the game on Monday night. He said, honestly, I think that Hufanga's mind is his best asset. The way that he sees and can understand the game and then turns that into jumping routes, getting around blockers, seeing how the play is flowing and putting himself in the best position to make a tackle, whether it's seeing things pre-play, seeing things as the routes are being run, realizing, oh, this is a screen, I need to jump it and, avoid this blocker and potentially pick off this ball and return it to the house. I mean, that's what that play was. It was all instincts because of the way that he sees the game, the way that he understands and breaks down tape. So I would argue that Nick Bosa would probably agree with you that the way that Talanoa Hufanga sees the game and then acts on those instincts is similar to one of the greatest safeties to ever play the game in Ed Reed. So I like the comparison. Yeah, I can see it.
Oh, so we're getting ahead of ourselves. There's a long way to go in Hufanga's career, but just kind of those
Book
those
it, Hall
traits.
of Famer.
Yeah, get him the yellow, get him the gold jacket right now. Leave it in his locker in Carolina. No, I just think that we're always looking to kind of compare players and put players on a pedestal and make these obvious comps. And I don't know. To me, it just there's more similarities between like a guy who Nick Bosa said plays more with his head rather than his gifts, his physical gifts. Because also, and you mentioned it too, like Hufanga, at least coming out of college, wasn't nearly lauded for his physical attributes. Like, he wasn't a combine monster, but he was the Pac-12 player, the defensive player of the year, because he was always around the football and always made plays. So that's just kind of the way I see it.